Okay, and I will update Twitter because I had that ready to go. Okay.
On Instagram as well. Yeah, I've just realized, well, not earlier today, realized that I listened to this, I read this as a mixture of physical audio and ebook, so I have not done a good job of collating my quotes.
That's okay, because I have like a couple, but this is one of those books where I have like specific scenes that stand out to me.
I don't have too many.
Hello, Nina. Hello, Cool Gamer. I think we'll give it maybe like a couple minutes, but then I think we can go ahead and
yeah, I know a couple of people who said they might come, but they weren't sure, so.
Okay, sounds good. And in the meantime, for the early birds, you guys can be the first to hear that we are having a Frances Harding read-along reunion episode. Because her new novella is coming out pretty soon, I think, like in a few months. So we're planning for a January live show is, I think, our tentative plan. Which is going to be very exciting. And I didn't realize that there was a cover reveal until you said something, Hana.
Yeah, I didn't either until I was doing my mid-year freakout. I just checked because for Unraveler as well, it showed up online before it was on Goodreads.
Yes.
I just don't know what they're doing with her books.
Honestly, yeah. Like, what? I don't understand either. And like a couple of her books have like won pretty big awards, so it's like kind of extra weird that they're just like, I don't know, it's coming out maybe. Nina, wait, no, so this is not the author for The Secret Garden that we're talking about now. Hana and I did a previous read-along for Frances Harding, who's one of our favorite authors, where we read all of her books, and she is still currently writing. So Frances Hodgson Burnett, unfortunately, is no longer with us.
Yes, but they do have confusingly similar names, which I only just realized as you said that.
Yeah. That is so weird. Actually, like the edition, which of course I don't have next to me, but like the edition I read this time, her name on the front is written F.H. Burnett, which I have never seen before.
No.
Yeah, it was a good question, Dana, because like I didn't realize either until we were talking about it that like they have the exact same first name. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and jump into introductory stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably by the time we start getting into the book, if people are just a couple minutes late, they might be here. So hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Not a Genre Book Club. This is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. And the reason I named it this is because I think one of the like recurring themes that I see from people who don't read a ton of like middle grade or young adult is that they think of it as a genre, and it's not. It's an age category, and it includes a lot of different kinds of books. And so I thought that would be a good name for the book club. And the whole point is that we select and read and discuss middle grade and young adult books, and we give them the same kind of discussion that like classics get, or that adult books get, and that it's less common for kidlit to get. We don't often do classics for this book club, but this is kind of a special episode, and it connects to our next book, which Hana will introduce at the end. But yeah, so that's what we're all about. My channel is obviously Wild Book Garden because we're here right now. And Hana, would you like to introduce yourself? Any like special content you have coming up or anything like that?
Yeah. Hi everyone. I am Hana. I sort of blog and Instagram and occasionally YouTube. I'm sort of everywhere and nowhere. But that's fine. But as previously discussed, you may remember me from the Frances Harding project that we did, which was sort of a precursor to this in some ways, I feel like.
Yes.
Yeah, like Cara, I also feel very strongly about people reading kidlit, which I think part of it, I did develop as a result of Cara talking about it. So this feels very fitting. And yeah, so I also read lots of middle grade as well as lots of other things. And yeah, excited for this project. And all the books we've chosen.
Yes, and as you will have seen, by the way, I already linked Hana's Instagram and blog in the description. And if you have seen either of our announcements, you will have seen that we have like 4 books coming up because we could not narrow it down anymore, which is a great...
Well, now 5 with the Frances Harding.
Now 5, so. I know, we count them all. This is just what happens. It's fine. Yeah, so we are going to... I'm going to mention content warnings very quickly before we get into the actual book discussion. So the ones that I have noted down, and I think all of these are going to be in the discussion as well. I have grief, racism, colonialism and Orientalism, ableism, and depression. Those are like the big ones. I don't know, Hana, can you think of any others?
Yeah, those are the main ones. Maybe also like parental neglect, I guess.
Yes, yeah, that one also will come up. That's a good point. Yeah, so just keep that in mind, that those are going to be part of the discussion. So, take care of yourselves accordingly. And let's just get into it. So, The Secret Garden. This is a reread for both of us. We're both very familiar with this book. So I thought we could start with if you want to talk just a little bit, Hana, about your kind of overall experience with this book, like throughout the times that you've read it, and any other like experience that you have with Frances Hodgson Burnett.
Yeah, well, so I read this first when I was probably 6 to 8 kind of range. We still have a big like audiobook box set of different children's classics. This was one of them. A Little Princess, also by Frances Hodgson Burnett, was also one of them. So that was the first time I listened to it, and I'm sure I must have listened to it multiple times while I was in primary school. And then I read it again, I think once as an adult, and then another again just now for this one. So I've read it quite a few times, and we've re-listened to that CD a lot, and we've listened to it now with my sisters as well. So I have listened to it in totality and in parts many, many times. And I think, this is a side point, but I think that the fact that I listened to all those classics as a child is what made me able to read adult classics.
I
from quite a young age.
Yeah.
I started reading like Austen and Dickens quite young, and I've never had a problem with classic language. So for parents out there, if you want your children to be able to read classics without like getting stuck with what they have to read in school, like get them listening to audiobooks early. This is
right. Expose them young. Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, it's never been like a major favorite in the way that some others have, but yeah, like I have read it many times, so it's kind of special to me in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think about like my early exposure to classics as being like really helpful, just for not making them feel intimidating. Like not only just exposing me to the language when I was younger, but even just like the mental kind of view of them as being like, oh, these are like hard books, they're not regular books. And it's like, well, they can be regular books if you treat them like that. In terms of my overall and like previous experience, The Secret Garden has been a very formative book for me. It still is, and it definitely is one of my favorites, although we will definitely be discussing the issues with it. I also started reading it pretty young, probably around that same age. I remember like I was gifted a copy from a family member. It was like this one and one other children's classic. I think it was maybe The Princess and the Goblin, although that doesn't matter. And this was one of the first books that I remember like rereading over and over again. I think because I enjoyed it, but I also think because it was like one of the books that I had that like was mine, it was my special book. And I have watched several movie versions. I also have a pretty clear memory of I think the movie is one of the first movies that like made me cry as a kid, and like at the ending specifically, and like I didn't understand why. I'm like, it's happy. Why am I crying? And it's just kind of become a comfort read for me. I don't even know how many times I've read it, but it's a lot. And actually, on this most recent read, I did partly on audio and partly physical. Shout out to Josephine Bailey, because I think she was an incredible narrator, and she has like a perfect Mary Lennox voice. And just as an example of how well I know this story, I basically was almost taking a nap while I was listening to part of it, and I did not miss any. Like I know this book very well. Yeah, I think classics, there's definitely like a learning curve, and I feel like the earlier you start that, the like less stressful it is later. Okay, so that's kind of mine and Hana's background with the book. Oh, and I did also read A Little Princess, but much, much, much later. Like I only read that for the first time a couple of years ago. So for a long time, The Secret Garden has been like the only Frances Hodgson Burnett that I've read. Like, did she also do Little Lord Fauntleroy? I don't think I've read that one.
Yes.
Okay.
I've read that one, but it's not as good as this Old Little Princess.
Yeah, that's kind of what I like had gathered. Okay, so kind of if we want to talk about like our general thoughts and experience with the book, like overall, I guess, review. Yeah, we talked about that a little bit with just our history with the book, but if you have any kind of like sum it up kind of thoughts, Hana.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think, I noticed the issues with it a lot more this time, which, I didn't necessarily pick up on as a primary schooler. But for all that, I still think it has important things to say. I really love Mary and Dickon, and like...
Yes, agreed.
So, and there's an amount of its timeness that I'm willing to look past in classics.
Right.
So I've just been reading, I've just been reading on your recommendations, Steeped in Stories, Cara. And yeah, a lot of the things that she was saying about, the importance, or like how children's books and children's classics especially still have value, even despite and because of the less savory things they might have in them. I was thinking about that a lot while I was reading this.
And how that can be kind of an opening for like conversations, and just like, yeah, not pretending that just because you like something or it's important to you, like you don't have to act like there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that rereading it as an adult, which I've done several times now, absolutely I notice problems that I don't think, like, I think some of them I kind of like vaguely noticed as a kid, but there are definitely issues with it that I think the older I get, and just like the more, I don't know, the more I experience life, the more I'm like, yeah, no, this part doesn't age well. But I also do love other things about it. I think the characters are great. I think Mary has one of my favorite character arcs that I've ever read. And I feel like in terms of the way that this book like formed parts of my book taste, I think this book is one of the reasons why I have such a strong attachment to like character, like certain kinds of character development. Yeah, and I do also think, like you said, Hana, I think it does have some really important and beautiful things to say. We're going to get into that later. There are some things it deals with that I think, even if the language isn't what we would use, I think for its time it's pretty impressive. Especially because I was doing just a little bit of reading on Frances Hodgson Burnett herself, and there are some aspects that seem to be pulled from her own life, that she was like writing parts of her own experience. So that makes sense. Okay. Another kind of general question before we get into the characters. We both of us have read quite a few classics, as we were discussing, and we've read quite a few children's classics. I am curious, like, in what ways do you feel like The Secret Garden fits into kind of like what you might expect from a children's classic, and in what ways is it different?
It's such an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think some of the things it has to say about raising children, and like lots of children's classics involve like children playing outdoors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I feel like the way this talks about the way parents and adults should relate to children and should look after children are unique in some ways. And yeah, lots of children's classics have like very good, likable children as their heroes. So this is like the fact that Mary is so awful at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the big ones I was thinking of. Like, I kind of jokingly, but also not jokingly, refer to her as like my favorite little brat. Like, she really is pretty awful in the beginning. And I think that is very different from a lot of, at least like a certain kind of children's classic that is sort of like the moral of the story, like here's what you should learn from like behaving like this child who is such a good person. And like Mary's not at the beginning. And something else that I think is unusual is that not only does she start out like genuinely unpleasant, but I think even at the end of the book, even though she's become a much kinder person and a better person, she's still spunky. Like, she still feels like herself. And I always say it's like, I feel like at the end of the book she could still scream somebody out of a tantrum if she had to, which I love that. I think that is pretty rare for children's books of this era that were generally more about like teaching proper behavior.
Yeah, it's not moralistic at all, really.
Yeah, like in terms of Mary's character, it's really not like, it's kind of like subtly showing like, oh look, when she starts treating people better, she has more friends. Like, what a concept. But yeah, it's really not like, I'm thinking of like, Louisa May Alcott, for example, or like some of these other, which I have enjoyed books from, but there's like a much different like tone or like a different like goal, I think, with these books. And yeah.
And even like compared to Little Princess, which is by the same author, if you compare Mary and Sarah, that like Sarah is much closer to perfect.
Yeah, I was thinking of that one as well. And it's, of course they're different books, but it's hard not to compare them, especially because some of the general premise is similar. Yeah. And I like what you said, Hana, about like the way that the adult characters are relating to the kids, and also like the way the book kind of like approves of treating kids like their own people, like, because I think that was pretty unusual for the time as well. Like Mary she ends up becoming a very independent person, and a lot of the big things that happen are because she chooses to do something, often like against what the adults have told her. That's shown as like not a bad thing, which is also kind of unusual, I think. Yeah. And I think you're right too about like the similarities with like, it's important to play outside and let children like run around on the moors and stuff like that. But I think when I reread this one, I think much more about like the way it's different from other classics. And then kind of speaking of differences, I think the first half approximately and the second half of this book feel very different and have very different tones. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. I just think that's interesting. And especially because I was just reading one of the Pages and Co. books, and they're rereading part of The Secret Garden. And Tilly, the main character, is like, oh no, like let's like skip the beginning stuff. Let's just go from when the garden starts getting better, like from when things start getting better. And I'm like, I understand that, but I've never done that. So just if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this is a slight spoiler, but the like the part when Colin goes to the garden is a lot later than I thought. Like it's nearly 60% through before Colin gets to the garden. And I was like, in my head, like that's near the beginning, and then the rest is them all in the garden together. But that's not what it actually is at all. So I think it's definitely interesting that it has that much build up. But I think that is important because Mary has to be awful so that she can grow.
We need to really see and understand what a little monster she is so that we can appreciate her later.
Yeah, and I mean, not just that, like we need to see how lonely she is and how,
Yes.
you know, how much she's been through and how difficult she's finding everything and how much upheaval like this all is for her, so that like, because then that's how when you understand how important the garden is for her and how much, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Like it means more because we have seen, like we have that setup. Like I think the book would be much less effective if we just started from her like looking for the garden or finding the garden. It's like we have to, yeah, we have to get to know her and see how lonely she is. And um yeah, I guess that's another thing, I guess, that I don't necessarily expect from like this kind of children's classic, although as we've been discussing, you know, they're not all the same. But I think that kind of like understanding about why Mary is the way that she is. Like I just really appreciate the way the narrator is like, she kind of sucks, but also it's not completely her fault. Like here's like the things that I mean, like her parents didn't care about her at all. Like she grew
Yeah,
up completely without love, basically, unless like, you know, some of the nannies that she had as caretakers who she did not treat very well. But yeah, so I think that kind of understanding is refreshing. Um yeah, and it's funny because like I think one of the reasons that I do still enjoy the first half, in addition to getting to see Mary, like her character arc and like getting to see all of these things that make the positive aspects mean more, I also think just like the gothic vibes I think are like really fun. Like that's always one of the things that I think about with this book is like, yes, it's the secret garden, it's like about the garden coming back to life and it's beautiful and I love that, but also I'm like every time the part with like Colin crying and her like finding him the first time, I was like, this is such a good scene. Like it's just so like dramatic and, you know, like gothic manner, and I love it. Okay. So, moving into characters, we have discussed her already, but Mary Lennox, my favorite little monster. Let's talk about her some more.
I just love her. She's so like slightly separately, I love the narrative voice, the way it's like she was awful but she didn't know she was awful.
Like the sly humor of this book I love.
um yeah, she grows so much, and it's so subtle the way she grows and
Mm-hmm.
the way she like starts to realize like how to relate to other people and children and adults and, you know, servants and, you know, every just all different kinds of people, and the way that being outdoors brings her, you know, back to life, and the way she's just so she's so clever. And she, like, you know, a lot of the time when I get frustrated with children's books, it's because that when the children are doing things that the adults have told them not to do, it's because either the adults haven't told them enough or the child is being incredibly stupid and making a terrible decision. And that's not Mary at all. Every time she does something she's not supposed to, she's so intelligent about it, and she's so logical about working through like the key must be here because this and this and this. and
Yes.
and I love how like how smart she is and how much she's able to use that to like help everyone ultimately, um, and how like how much she learns to care about other people, and like her whole relationship with Dickon, and how much she helps Colin and, you know, Ben Weatherstaff, and like just how she brings out the joy in everyone despite being such a brat.
Yes, yeah. She's like that typical like young child who brings out the best in everyone, but she does it by being like really cranky.
Yeah,
Um
like if you compare her to like a Heidi, for instance,
yeah, I was just
Heidi does a lot of the same, like running around outdoors and bringing grumpy people joy, but Heidi is like not the same.
yeah, I obviously love Mary. I've been talking about that throughout. Yeah, it really is just like so it is so satisfying to see her be like so smart and so like in control, and um Yeah, I like the part, like that rainy day where she ends up just exploring all the rooms. It's like Mary as a child was never told she had to ask adults for permission to do anything. So she's like, I'm just gonna explore. Like, and I kind of love that because it's like, yeah, why would she know that you're supposed to do that? Also, Mrs. Medlock is not like a terribly active guardian, so like it kind of doesn't make sense to ask her for permission anyway. And I also like even the way that she asks her uncle for a bit of earth. It's like even that is like so smart because she's like, I'm not gonna tell him I found the garden where his wife died. But I'm just like,
but
hey,
even if no one wants it, like
yeah. It's like it was so smart. It's like she's like, here's like the contract. And I'm closing all the loopholes and not telling him where it is. I love that. Yeah, I love Mary. I love her so much. And there's actually one of the few quotes that I did save that we can talk about later, but it's like, I think something that is so emblematic of like why she's such a great character is when like everybody's panicking because like Colin is like really sick and he's, having this tantrum and he's gonna like, scream himself ill basically. And they like run to get Mary because she's awful too. And like Mary even like she thinks about it later and she's like, oh yeah, like the adults were like, she's just as bad as he is. She's the only thing. And they're right, like she does. I love it. Yeah. And I think like with all of that, there's also though all of these really tender moments with her. Like when she starts like clearing the garden for the first time and she's like, oh, it looks like the little like flowers can't breathe, so I'm just like gonna make them, like when she makes friends with the robin the first time and it's like this is the first like living being that has been nice to her ever, and it's just like so beautiful to see her like realize that.
and like when she's counting the people I like, and the fact that the robin's one of them.
And then she's like, how many people like me? And she's like, that's 3 for me. She's like, that's pretty good. I love it. Yeah. And I think one of the things keeping it from being a little sad is that, I mean, obviously the beginning part of the book is much sadder, and especially when you realize like not only did she lose her parents, but her parents never seemed to care about her at all. But I think one of the reasons that to me the book doesn't feel sad is because she's so like matter of fact about it. Like when her and Ben Weatherstaff are talking and they're basically like, we are both really unpleasant people. That's why we get along. I enjoy that. Okay, so I'm sure we'll have lots more to say about Mary as we go, but should we talk about Colin or Dickon next? Your choice, Hana.
I feel like I have more to say about Colin, even though I like Dickon a lot more.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I guess since we kind of already talked about that part of the plot, we can talk about Colin next then.
I find Colin endlessly frustrating, and I'm not quite sure why I find him so much more frustrating than Mary, because they're both pretty equally awful at the beginning. But I don't know if Mary feels like she has more growth, and Colin feels like he never quite outgrows his selfishness by the end of the book. Mary has learned to care about other people, but Colin hasn't quite. But like similar to Mary, like his story is so sad, and he's been through quite similar things to what she has in some ways. But I appreciate everything that his story represents, even though there is definitely a lot of ableism baked into it. But as a character, I find him very annoying.
Yeah. I feel very similarly. I understand why he is the way he is. I think he's a very well-written character, but I don't necessarily love the scenes he's in as much as some of the others. And I think you have a good point about, like, it feels like to me his character arc is still unfinished, which might be the point. I mean, like, he's been living this way for so long, it makes sense that it wouldn't happen overnight. But even like near the end where he's like, you know, doing like these lectures for them, it's like, it's funny, it's kind of funny, but it's also like, yeah, I think he's still sort of thinking that he's the one in charge and they're all just like there to serve him maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
Definitely less so than earlier in the book. But yeah, I think Mary has definitely grown a lot more, and she's much more caring about other people. And I think Colin is still kind of like growing out of his like selfishness and like self-centeredness, which again, it is understandable that he would grow up that way, but I think that is one of the reasons why he's not like his character arc doesn't like hit me the way that Mary's does. Yeah.
Yeah, like I feel like Mary, to an extent, by the end, like starts to be aware of her own privilege in some ways, and Colin doesn't feel like he is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think he's on like the right path, you know, he is getting better, but yeah, I definitely think that he hasn't come as far as Mary has. And he just isn't as self-aware as Mary is. Like even from the beginning, like even when Mary is still a very unpleasant person, from pretty early on, she's kind of starting to recognize, like the first time when she's like, wow, I always hate people. Apparently, people also hate me. Like even stuff like that. It's like from pretty early on, Mary is kind of like recognizing the way other people like perceive her, the way that like she comes off to people, and Colin has never had to do any of that. So I think it'll definitely take him longer to get there. Yeah. And Dickon.
Dickon is like almost like a proto-manic pixie dream boy. Like
okay, that was the exact thing I was thinking earlier. I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
Like I love him, but you know, he's just there with his squirrels and his fox and his crow and like being the nature spirit that he is. And
yeah,
but I love him. I love the way he brings Mary out of her shell, and or not that she was in it, you know, like shows her like what she can be and what the garden can be. And I love how like thoughtful he is. And you know, when all the adults are like, you know, Mary's like, oh, Dickon's gonna do it, and they're like, that's fine, Dickon can do it anyway. Whatever he wants.
That is like one of my favorite things, is how anytime they're gonna do something and the adults are like, I don't know how I feel about this, and she's like, well, Dickon's doing it, and they're like, oh, okay, bye. Like, do you guys want to like go camp out on the moor for like a week? That's fine. Yeah, I agree. I feel exactly the same about Dickon. He's like so perfect that you would think he would be annoying, but he's not. Like he's just such a genuinely like lovely person. He does very much feel like some kind of dryad or forest spirit. And I think also, I think maybe one of the reasons that he doesn't feel like annoyingly perfect is because like, I don't know, because of like his character's background, like it doesn't feel, I don't know, I guess just making him like, you know, a working class like character, like I think that makes it feel more grounded. Yeah. I mean, and even though like arguably this book does do a little bit of the like romanticizing like poverty and like the cottage and everything, I think that in general we're like meant to see that him and his family, like not that they have like a lot to go around, because they don't, but like the fact that they have enough to eat. And I don't know, I just think his like interesting position in terms of social class for some reason is one of the reasons that he doesn't feel like overly perfect. Because like if he were like Mary's, you know, in like her social level, I feel like he would be a lot more annoying for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah, no, I agree. I can't say why, but I agree. He definitely would be.
It's like, yeah. I think that's hilarious that you were thinking like manic pixie dream boy, because that was the exact thing I was thinking earlier when I was writing my notes. I was like, why do I like Dickon instead of like finding him so obnoxious? And I think also because like there are like little things about him that are not like romanticized and exaggerated. Like when Mary's talking about like, I think he's the most beautiful angel in the world, and Martha's like, he's not actually good looking. Or the fact that like, you know, understandably he doesn't know, like he can read printing, but he can't read writing or like cursive. Like there are those details that feel more like realistic, and I think that helps. Yeah, when he draws the picture of like the missile thrush for Mary, and she knows that it means that he's going to keep her secret. Oh, I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah, but he can't keep a secret from his mother. And
we're going to get to Mrs. Sowerby. Like yeah. Yeah. I love how like every time Mary like hears a story about like Dickon or like their mother, like she's like, I just love hearing about them. I'm like, me too, Mary. Like, this is just great. Hello. Okay, so speaking of the Sowerby family, do we want to talk about Martha before we get into her and Dickon's mother?
I love Martha. She's just so no nonsense. She's like, you are going to need to dress yourself. I don't care what you're doing in India. You are going to put some clothes on and go outside and like get some fresh air and like.
Yeah. I love too how like it seems like one of the main motivators for like Mary actually starting to like dress herself and help herself is like she's thinking like Martha keeps judging me and I don't like that. Like, I just think that's hilarious. Yeah, I also really like Martha. I just love how like genuinely like friendly and like cheerful she is, but again, like Dickon, she still feels like a real person. And I like that she, you know, she immediately reaches out to Mary, and even when Mary is like, you know, pretty nasty to her, she's like she doesn't take it, but she also doesn't like, I don't know, leave in a huff or anything. Like she's a very like patient person as well. Even though we're told from Mary, it's like she's like, well, I used to slap my servants if they like talked back to me. And she's like, I think Martha would slap me back. And I was like, I think she would, yeah. Anything else on Martha? You know, okay, speaking of things like you were talking about with like thinking that Colin in the garden happened much earlier, I always remember Martha as being a much more major character than she is. Like, I don't know, it's weird because I was rereading it, I'm like, she's actually not in the book that much. Like there's that section near the middle where we see a lot of her because like Mary has a lot of conversations with her, but like after that she just kind of, I don't know, she just like pops up every once in a while. Yeah, so I like her, but apparently I remember her as being like much more prominent than she actually is. Yeah. Okay, and then Mrs. Sowerby, their mother. I just love her out of all proportion to the number of pages she's in. Like, she's like such a good mom, and like I love when I think it's Colin who like near the end when she because of course she finds out about the garden and everyone's like, oh, that's fine. And Colin says like, I always thought of my mother as being somebody like you, and she just like hugs him and says, yeah, I love her. I don't know if I have any other specifics.
Yeah, no, like, I'm the same. I don't. Yeah, I have only feelings about Mrs. Sowerby. No
only
words.
Feelings, exactly.
She's just like she's everyone's mother, and you know, like she knows that Mary and Colin just need love, and she's willing to provide that, even though she doesn't have a lot of time or money or resources. And I think, I don't know if we're going to come back to class, but I really noticed the class stuff this read round that I didn't before.
Yeah, I know, that's another thing. It's like, every time I read this I notice this more. Yeah, I agree. I love Mrs. Sowerby, and yes, how generous she is when she doesn't have a lot, which is, I mean, something that like statistically they have found is that the people who have less tend to give a lot more. Yeah, and I really love too how she she's very obviously like nurturing and loving, but she also still treats the kids like they can make decisions. Like, I think she's kind of a good example of what we were saying with the adults in general about, like, there's actually a lot of independence from the children in this book. And like when Dickens says, he's like, hey, like, I have a secret. It's not a bad secret, but it's something I'm really not supposed to tell anyone. She's like, I've known you your whole life. You can have all the secrets you want. Like, I love that. What good parenting, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. I have no more to add. Only love for Mrs. Salby.
I love Mrs. Salby so much. Yeah, okay, so for a very different kind of parent and adult character, do we have any thoughts about Mr. Craven? About her, Mary's uncle, Colin's dad? Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say because we basically only see him in 2 scenes.
Yeah.
And
we hear about him a lot more than we see him.
Yeah. And he, I don't know, it's hard because he, like, obviously he's dealing with so much grief, but that doesn't excuse how he's treated his son.
Exactly.
And he's interesting because he clearly cares about Mary, like, in his own way. And like when he sends her presents and stuff, like, he is thinking about her, and he doesn't really know how to look after a child, but he's trying his best. But it doesn't seem like he ever tried with Colin.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed too, is like, as much as I like when he interacts with Mary, it always feels like, why didn't you make this kind of effort with your child? Yeah,
I guess in some ways he did, because Colin also has lots of books and like hasn't ever interacted with him, which is similar in some ways, but still it feels different.
Yeah, because he like actively avoids seeing Colin because he reminds him of his wife, and like that's the thing that I just can't look past. Like, I feel a lot of sympathy for Mr. Craven in terms, like you said, of the grief that he's experiencing, and yeah, just like, I do feel for what he's going through, but I don't have a lot of patience for people who take grief and they use it against people who are also grieving. You know, it's like Colin lost his mother, or he's like never known his mother, and the fact that not just that his dad, you know, treats him like this, like neglects him, you know, emotionally, if not like physically, not just the fact that he does that, but like everybody knows that. Like, imagine everyone knowing, like, oh yeah, he hates his son because he looks like his wife. Yeah, and I do like that the book seems to be pointing out that that's not okay. You know, like the way that his character arc goes, I think we're supposed to see like this growth from him as being really important, and like Colin deserving better. But yeah, I find him a very frustrating character in a lot of ways, because I just, like, it's not Colin's fault. I mean, it's nobody's fault, but like, it certainly isn't the child who was born.
Yeah, and that line that Colin says, like, if I were a ghost, my father might be fond of me. Like,
yeah. And the fact that, like, that Colin is so matter of fact about all of this. He's like, oh yeah, this is just the way things are. Like, my dad wishes I was dead, you know. It's how it goes. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not supposed to be. Yeah. I think the only other character things, I don't know if we want to talk about like the Robin or Ben Weatherstaff. I just think the characterization in general in this book is great. Like, even the characters that are not like favorite characters, I think are written so well. So I don't know if you had like any particular thoughts.
Yeah, no, I don't know if I do, but they're all like, even, you know, Mrs. Medlock and Ben Weatherstaff, we don't see them a whole lot, but we still really know who they are. They're really like well drawn. And yeah, Ben Weatherstaff is great, and I love that he is not scared to call out Mary for anything. He's like, you are a grumpy old woman. And
when he's like, maybe you have blood in your veins after all instead of sour butter. Like, yeah, and I like that she does that back to him too. Like, yeah. And one thing that I noticed with the way the Robin is written, like, because he's such a great character too, and I feel like Francis Hodgson Burnett really nailed the balance of, like, yes, he is written like an animal, you know, like an actual Robin would behave, but also in the way that like somebody who understands that animals have personalities, you know, like I loved that. Okay, so I think the rest are like theme questions, which there's definitely a lot to discuss in this one. Yeah, I mean, really, there's a lot for all of these, so it doesn't really matter where we start. But I guess, like, arguably one of the most noticeable ones is the colonialism and racism in the novel. Like, even just the premise of, like, Mary has to leave India and go to England. So yeah, I don't really have like a really like specific question about this. It's just like a very big element of the book. So I would be interested in hearing any specific thoughts you have about it, because it is certainly present.
Yeah, it is. I hadn't, I didn't really pick up on it when I was whatever 6 to whatever age I was rereading it regularly. And I knew like from general discourse that it was there. So I was on this reread, I was kind of looking for it. And at the beginning I was like, it's not great, but it's not so bad. Like, it's insensitive, but she leaves India early and,
yeah,
it's okay. But then it just kept being there even after she left India. And it's like, even when the explicitly, it portrays all Indians as like servile and having no thoughts, which is its own thing. But then even after that kind of fades out, it's never addressed, it just fades out. But even after it does, all the discussions of India are still about like magic and, snake charmers and all of that kind of stuff, which is also very Orientalist. So even when it's not explicitly racist, it's still not great.
Yeah, the mysticism is a good point. That is definitely present. I think also one of the things that I noticed this time around was, or I think probably on other rereads, I just don't remember, but like even like the part of the story that's like she goes to England and she's like running in the fresh air and like all of this.
Yeah.
The way that they keep comparing, like when she's like, oh, Mary never had any energy in India. Like, she was always so tired. She never wanted to eat. And it's like, obviously like people are sensitive to different climates and I understand that. But there's something about like complaining about the climate of the country that you colonize. Like, this is like when I read like frontier era books set in the US and they're talking about what a hard living it is. And I'm like, the indigenous peoples were doing all right before you guys showed up. So there's that part as well that just like, I don't know. It's not a great look. It's not reading the room.
Yeah. No. Well, and also like, yeah, she was ill because nobody was looking after her, and she probably wasn't eating very well, and she wasn't like playing with anyone. She was just being angry and cross with everyone all the time. Yeah, I'm not surprised she was ill, but like it wasn't the fault of the climate in India.
Right, like it's not like India's fault. Like, oh, children can't grow up healthy in India. Like, yeah. And then I also, like, you mentioned like the like overt or like explicit things like fading out of the story, which like I also noticed. Like, there's that conversation that her and Martha have that every time I read it, I'm just like, when Martha's like, I thought you'd be black. Which there's just like so many layers to unpack in that. But even after stuff like that stops happening, because it's like as Mary becomes a nicer person, that kind of thing stops happening, which you could read as like almost like implicit, like this isn't okay, but it's never actually addressed or like commented on. And yeah, like the other times that India is brought up, it tends to be in a very like mystical context. Yeah, I think that there are, like, Mary has like positive memories from India as well, which we do hear about, and I think that is interesting. but yeah, like in general, it's just not a very. It's like very much portrayed as like the place that she had to leave to like get better and everything.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and even like the way like at the very beginning of the book when the cholera outbreak happens, even like the way that is described and like the servants like grieving and everything, even that feels like a little bit like othering,
Mm-hmm.
or more than a little bit, which again that's at the beginning of the book, and I think the narration is very intentionally writing the way that like Mary experiences this, but still it's like yeah, I just kind of trailed off. I didn't have a point there. I was like it doesn't age well. um yeah, any other like specifics about.
I think you froze there for a second. Can you?
Oh no. Okay, let me try.
No, it's probably my internet. It's been slow today.
Okay. Are we good now?
Yeah, I can hear you okay now. It
Okay.
seems to be working.
Okay. Yeah, so obviously the colonialism and like the discussion of race, it's like even though the part in India happens, like, it's a very small part of the book, but it does. It's like yeah, she keeps bringing it up, and it's like maybe you shouldn't. So I don't know if you had any other like specific points with that.
I don't know if I did. I think we've talked about most of it. Yeah, it's just generally it's not great because I was thinking about it in comparison to like Little Princess, which has a very explicit like, you know, magical person of color character.
Yeah.
And this doesn't do that. But it falls into a lot of other harmful tropes. So like
Yeah.
she's covered all of her pain.
right. And isn't in A Little Princess, isn't she rich because of like a diamond mine or
Yeah.
something? So that is like also, I think a very specific like, I don't know. It's such an understatement to call it like problematic, but I think yeah, The Secret Garden is almost more like sneaky about some of it. Um, yeah, like there are like we've been talking about, there are moments where it almost almost seems like we're commenting on some of this, like even later on when Mary starts like recognizing that like, oh, I'm a really unpleasant person. The way that she starts thinking about her like her nurse or like, you know, the servants, it is more sympathetic and understanding, but it's like the negative portrayals were very like explicit and like specific, and like the more positive stuff is very vague. um yeah.
Yeah, and she never really thinks of them as people, like we were talking about how she thinks Martha would slap her back. Like it's the way she thinks about the Indian servants in comparison is like just very kind of one dimensional, I guess.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
also the quote, there's a quote that Mrs. Sowerby says about how children have to learn that they only get like one slice of the orange that is the world, which is a great quote in the context of child rearing. But I was like, this, like coming from a country that colonized half the planet, like.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of those moments that like, yeah, this reads differently if you think about like the countries that people are from. Or even just like the historical era as well. um yeah, and even like the scenes, like we barely see her mother at all. We have like that one conversation, but um just like the privilege of her being like, oh, I know we should have gone to the hills last week, but I wanted to go to this party. And it's like, and it like all of the servants have to stay there if you're there, so like all of these other people are dying because you wanted to go to this dinner party. Like it just,
Yeah.
which I think we are supposed to criticize her for that, like it's very clearly written like this is not an okay thing, but it just it's I think exacerbated by like the racial component of all of this. Okay, so another big thematic element with mixed results, mixed portrayals, is the description of disability. And I think this is one of the ones. Well, I'm very interested to hear what you think, because I think a lot of it is not great, but then it's interesting to see the parts where Burnett seems to be, I don't know, she's better at some of it than I expected. But what are your overall thoughts on, like, specifically with Colin? I think is kind of the an example.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like Colin is not physically disabled. There's nothing actually physically wrong with him, and she's probably right that, I mean, no, she's definitely right that like getting outside and believing that he was okay is most of the battle in his case. But also the discussion around like, well, having a hunchback and how terrible that is, and like the fact that he thinks he's going to die because of it, and the fact that like his father, like the fact that his father thinks he has a hunchback and that's enough for him to like write him off completely, like all of that is very ableist. So
yeah,
like good and bad, like you said.
Yeah. I think like with this reread, it was interesting because I think the specific, like Colin's specific experiences are actually a more like nuanced portrayal than I remembered, but the stuff around that wasn't. Like one thing that I appreciate is that when Colin, basically out of spite because of Ben Weatherstaff, like he like stands up, and I like that they specifically point out that like he was not ill, like he did not have an injury with his legs. Like it's not like he like positive thinking his way out of an actual injury. And I really appreciate that distinction. Like you know, they're talking about like all this like positive thoughts and how that can make you better, and like I just like that it wasn't like he doesn't actually have you know, anything wrong with his back or his legs, and that was like explicitly pointed out to us, that it really was like a way that he's been like treated, and how he hasn't been like living in a very healthy way. But yeah, the discussion around the hunchback thing is like very ableist, and it's like I wonder if there is part of it that is meant to be like we're also seeing how like the society at the time viewed people who had any kind of like physical difference. So I think that could be a component. But like the fact that like his father didn't even want to look at him, like that is, I think, more specific. Like that's not just like the way that other people would treat him, because I think that could be a valid concern, you know, is that like not necessarily that you're okay with the way people treat disabled people, but you just notice that like, you know, they do treat them differently. On the other hand, Colin has a lot of money. Like I don't necessarily think that he would have like the same kind of experience as like other disabled people would. And even with Mr. Craven, it's like the way people talk about him is obviously not okay, but it doesn't actually seem like it doesn't actually seem like he's treated differently because of it. Like they're kind of, they talk about how like sad he is, but they don't really, I don't know. What did you think about, like, did you get the feeling that the other characters like do, like that does affect how they view him? Or
it doesn't feel like it does. I mean, it's barely ever mentioned, other than, I mean, Colin mentions it with respect to him, but kind of no one else really does. And he's not physically disabled either, and like we actively see him like hiking and stuff. Like there's nothing, like it doesn't impede his life in any way, other than when they're all talking about how beautiful his wife was and how surprised everyone was that she wants to marry him, which is probably not unrealistic. But
yeah, I agree. It's another one of those like, I don't know, some things some things you did a lot better than others. Yeah. And also we talked about this a little bit, but kind of related to the discussion of like disability versus I don't know what you would call, I guess like mental health issues with like Colin, for example. But the portrayal of mental illness in this book, like specifically depression, I thought was very interesting because on the one hand, you have this sort of like magical thinking, like just get rid of the bad thoughts and put good thoughts in their place. Like, so there it is simplified, but also I think like in a way that was very ahead of its time because like I mean, we're always like scientists today are always finding out more about the way that the brain affects every other part of the body. You know, it can actually like make you sicker or make you better. And so I think that is really interesting. And it's in a way like that Frances Hodgson Burnett is showing that it's not all in your head, you know, like, or if it is in your head, that doesn't mean that it's not real. And I like that. But yeah, I don't know. I'm very conflicted feelings about this. So what do you think? This is like I'm not even giving you a question. I'm just like let's discuss this like mess.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's like you say, it is ahead of its time, and like, you know, there's a reason that people say to go out and touch grass if they think, yes. you know, like it's it going like being outside and thinking like when it's the bits like he thought that he would live and he didn't know, but that was half the battle, or I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. And she's not wrong, even though it's, I mean, she's not quite right, but she's not entirely wrong either.
Yeah. And actually one of the things I found when I was reading about her is that she actually struggled with depression for a fairly big chunk of her life. And she wrote The Secret Garden after that started happening. So I imagine that she is partly drawing on her own experiences, which I also think is interesting. And that makes sense, you know, that like she would get some of this right if she's like talking about how she's experienced it. One thing I also think is interesting is I feel like, so like the discussion of like responsibility in this book I think is incredibly interesting, just like in general, but also how that relates to these issues of like mental illness and just like circumstances. Like I feel like with all of the characters we're given a really good idea of what they've been through and why that affects, like why that should, you know, cause sympathy and how that affects the way they are. But I feel like with Colin and Mary, and honestly, you know, Mr. Craven too, possibly, like it's just really interesting because I feel like we're kind of meant to see, okay, so here's what they're dealing with. Here, these things are serious, but also that doesn't mean you can treat people however you like. Which I think that's a conversation that we're still having is like, yes, your like any kind of like illness or, you know, difficult circumstances absolutely affects the way that you know, like treat people or anything. And like, that is understandable, but also there's a point where you are responsible for your actions, you know? So I don't know if you felt like that from this book.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it does a good job of explaining, but not justifying everyone's behaviors.
Yes.
And I think they all grow to realize that for themselves as well.
Yeah. Very well said. Okay, so another big one that we were talking about is the discussion of class in this book. And arguably, I don't know, I feel like this is maybe one of the more successful things that she comments on, which is interesting because obviously Mary and Colin are both very wealthy. But how, like, let me ask how successful you felt like the critique of certain like classist elements was.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the first moment where it like occurred to me as a issue was when Martha's talking about like, yeah, none of our children have enough to eat. And I was like, okay, we're just gonna gloss right over this apparently and not spend any more time on this. And then I'd forgotten that Mary and Colin eventually pay Mrs. Salby for the food. So when she starts sending them extra food, I was like, she already doesn't have enough for her own children. What? And these children have so much money. what is going on here? But I'm glad that they notice, and it, like, I think because it's only one line, it would have been so easy for her to leave out. So the fact that she included the fact that they started paying her for it, I think, is significant.
Yeah. And even though, like, and you know, Mrs. Sowerby is obviously a very loving mother and a very good mother, so that is a big factor. But like you were saying, the fact that the kids don't usually have enough to eat, that's just life. So like there is kind of an element of glossing over it, or the fact that, like, you know, as much as we love Martha and Dickon, it's like they kind of sometimes feel a little bit like the romanticized, like, cottagecore, like, poverty almost.
Like fresh milk from the cow, and like...
Yes. Yeah, it always makes me think of that part in Sense and Sensibility where, like, Willoughby will not shut up about the cottage, him and the older Ferris brother. It's like that we want to, like, cosplay like we're poor. So there is definitely some of that, but I also think it's interesting that we do sometimes get those reminders, like, yeah, the fact that it's pretty impressive that, like, Mary and Colin, like, do notice that, you know?
Yeah.
Especially Colin, because we know
I definitely think it's Mary that picked up.
I know. I feel bad because that was my thought too. It's like probably Mary noticed and she told him. And even like when she is asking, like, Dickon to buy, like, the garden tools, you know, and the fact that, like, oh, she has allowance, so she's going to do it. It's like her way of thinking about money is obviously very casual, because it can be, but she is still noticing that not everybody has the same relationship with, like, money and resources.
Yeah, and the moment with the skipping rope as well, where she, like, twigs that, Martha, that was your money that you used, and thanks her for it.
Yeah, it's like, I'm so proud of my yeah. Yeah. I think that is really, really well done, especially because we see how Mary is still not very, like, confident with it. Like, she's still sort of like, when Martha's like, oh, you're welcome, she's like, Elizabeth Ellen would give me a hug, and Mary's like, do you want a hug? And she's like, no, that's fine. She's like, I guess this is what people do when they say thank you. I will hug you if you want. And it's like, it's just so funny. Yeah. There's something else I was gonna say that we were just talking about. In the meantime, any other thoughts on class? I do feel like when we were talking with, like, about Martha and Dickon, it's like, even though they are kind of romanticized, I feel like they're still very complete characters, and they're actual people. Like, there's a kind of, like, respect with writing them, and even the way that, like, the Yorkshire, like, accent or dialect is, like, talked about, like, the way that, like, Mary respects it enough to treat it as another language that she is learning. Like, I thought that was cool. And that's also one of the more, I guess, positive mentions of India from her, is that she's thinking about, like, that's something that you do as a mark of respect, is if you respond in somebody's dialect. So I don't know if you had thoughts on, like, on the like, Yorkshireness. Like, obviously you would have more knowledge about that than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would be unusual to see it written down that way in a modern book.
Yeah.
Which I think this was the first time I'd ever actually read it, either in print or ebook. I think I've only ever listened to it before, so the narrator always does it in a Yorkshire accent, but I hadn't realized, like, how explicitly it's written in a Yorkshire accent. But yeah, I agree. Like, the fact that she actively tries to learn it, and then so does Colin, and that, like, Martha and Dickon are allowed to make fun of them for it.
Yes. Yeah. And that Mary isn't offended at all. Like, I think that's really, really sweet. Yeah. Let me see my other notes. If you have any other thoughts on the discussion of class, go for it, because I'm trying to remember. I thought there was one other point I wanted to talk about, and now I can't remember.
I think that's most of it. Yeah, I mean, kind of similar to what we've been saying, like the fact that I think Mrs. Selby says that, like, if it weren't for Dickens' garden, we wouldn't have enough. And like the fact that that's on the shoulders of a 12-year-old, or I think he's 12.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like too that we do still get those comments, like from, like, Martha, for example. She outright says to Mary, like, when I see you not eating your porridge, and I think about like I like that she does say that, you know, like, she, even though she seems kind of blasé about like the fact that the kids don't get to eat enough and that's just how it is, she's not afraid to, I don't know, to be honest with Mary about how lucky she is. And like you were saying earlier, I really do feel like by the end, especially, that Mary does have some kind of understanding of how privileged she is. And like we even see, like, yeah, when she's getting gifts from people, like when she gets that giant box from her uncle, and like she seems to understand that even though she's had a lot of bad things happen to her earlier in her life, that the situation that she's in now, she's kind of getting, like, she has to do the work to like change and become a better person, but I feel like she's recognizing that other people are making it easier for her.
Mm-hmm.
Which I like.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's so throwaway. Like the line about Dickens' garden, it's in a conversation about how Dickens' good at gardening. It's not a conversation about how the Southies don't have enough. And it's like blink and you'll miss it.
Yeah.
Moment. So like it's there, but it's in some ways maybe it's not a bad thing that it's not emphasized, because it's there throughout. But equally, I don't know if it's like given the weight that it deserves.
Yeah, I agree, especially like with the later mentions of it, because I feel like the earlier part of the book is more explicit, like because we have Mary pointing out, like, these were your wages, Martha, and like Martha saying, like, my brothers and sisters would love to have your like porridge crumbs or whatever. Yeah, so I do definitely think you're right, and that it's almost like de-emphasized as the book goes on, because it's like now we're focusing on other stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like in a way maybe the reason that I think of like the discussion of class as being one of the stronger or the more positive like themes is maybe just based on the characterization, you know, and like the way that all of the, you know, working class and like servant characters, like Dickon and Martha are like, and Mrs. Sowerby are arguably the most explicitly likable, you know, people. And they're all like working class. I think that's pretty cool. And again, that's something that I think is unusual. She does this in A Little Princess as well, but yeah. So any thoughts on like that characterization portion of the class discussion before we move on?
Yeah, I agree. I think the fact that they are so humanized is important as part of it.
Yeah. Okay, I think the last sort of theme question, what do you think about the discussion or like not discussion of like the religious and spiritual elements in the book? Because I think it's very interesting. Just for a little context, this is one of the things that I was reading about, and I guess there was some discussion like during the author's lifetime. People were thinking like, was this like a Christian Science thing? Because I guess I don't know that much about Christian Science, but like apparently that sort of like positive thinking as healing can be like a part of that. But it's not like she was not herself a Christian scientist, but she did get into the sort of like spiritualism. I don't know. It was very interesting. Apparently she like didn't identify with any specific like religion or denomination. But people were kind of constantly asking like, is this supposed to be this? And I guess not. So it's a very interesting mix. So thoughts on that?
Yeah. It was, all the stuff about magic is really interesting. And I think that like the fact that it's juxtaposed with like Ben Weatherstaff, who didn't like going to church, and like because that didn't need to be there. It feels very deliberate. I don't know what she was trying to say, but felt like it was something.
I don't know what this is, but it's something. Yeah. But then it's interesting too, because like I was like, this is like a very specific thing that we're told. But then he's the one who says, well, we could sing the doxology, and that is like a very like explicitly religious like prayer or hymn. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. I kind of get the feeling that, well, I guess this makes sense based on what I read about her. Like the kind of spiritual but not religious thing is kind of like the feeling I get from the book. But I do like the way that Mrs. Sowerby puts it. What does she call it? Like the big good thing or something like that. And I like that. And especially for a book in this time period, it seems more accepting of like different religions and different beliefs. And I definitely don't think that this book is like as outright religious as some children's classics are. Like Heidi is much more explicitly religious. Yeah. So I feel like if there is any specific religious message that the author is trying to communicate in this one, I guess to me it feels just kind of like follow the good thing however that looks to you, and kind of let everyone else do that as well. Like that's sort of the only specific message that I can get from it.
Yeah, but it feels like, aside from the doxology, it feels like nature is the thing with power rather than like some other external force. I don't know.
Yeah. I can see that. And I think it's interesting too, because like there's a lot of, it's not always clear when they're like talking about, you know, for example, like magic or like positive thinking or something versus prayer, which I mean, obviously that's something that like can still overlap in discussions today, but yeah, it's very, I think she's very clearly like non-denominational. And it's very interesting. And I still like, I've read this book so many times, and every time I get to those parts, I'm still like, what are you saying here?
You want to check?
Yeah, it's interesting. And you're right, it's a lot less Christian than a lot of similar classics, and like they don't go to church, which most people would have. Well, I mean, Colin doesn't go anywhere, but
Colin doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. Yeah. That is interesting, and that's a good point about we're not really told about any of the characters going to church. Does Mrs. Sowerby talk about it? For some reason I feel like she is one of the characters that has more like, that talks more specifically about religion, but now I can't think of a part that she does.
Yeah, well, I guess they must. Dickon learned the doxology in church.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's very vague. Yeah. Which also I wonder too. That does sort of make sense with a book that is like following kids for the most, like especially kids at the age, because not that they wouldn't have like
and kids who have no adult supervision as well.
Yes. Right. They're like, oh, magic, like that thing that we sing in church, like that makes sense for like this age especially. And not that kids can't have like, you know, thoughts and questions about that, but I think that this sort of like overlap between like prayer and beliefs and positive thinking and magic and also nature, like all of that feels very like, yeah, if you're like 10 years old and you've never, like, especially Mary, because I don't think she's had any kind of religious education. Or like, yeah, so that makes sense, I guess. That they wouldn't have a lot of like strongly defined ideas. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's all the specific questions or topics I had. Hana, do you have anything that you want us to discuss specifically before we talk about like favorite scenes or quotes or anything?
Nothing major. I mean, this will come up in the quotes, but like we didn't really talk about the descriptions of nature itself and how much I love like the garden,
Yes.
as a kind of almost as a character in its own right.
Yes, that is a good point. I didn't really write anything about the writing specifically, but I love it. And this is reminding me, I'm like, I need to like actively seek out other books that she wrote because I love the way that she just does, yeah, like beautiful setting descriptions, but also like her humor really works for me, especially through the lens of Mary. And we were talking about how much we enjoy the way she writes her characters too. So yeah, the writing is definitely. And I think also one of the things that makes this, like Secret Garden, I think a good kind of beginner's classic is not just that the language is more approachable than some because it is a children's classic, but I just feel like the storytelling feels, it's not quite as internal as I think some classics are, you know, like there's more action, there's more like dialogue and character stuff. But again, we do have those really beautiful descriptions too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just looking at my notes, and I think we've pretty much covered everything. The only other thing I had written down is the number of secrets, like not just the garden, but like Mary finds Colin and Colin says, "This is going to be a secret," and then Colin learns to walk, and Colin's like, "This is going to be a secret."
Yeah.
What is it with Colin and his secrets?
Yeah. And that's like another thing that like I think especially for that age like makes sense. Like that even that part where Mary is first looking, like she first hears about the garden and she's like so captivated by the idea of like a secret garden. She's like, I could go in and play by myself and nobody would know where I was. I was like, I get it though. Yeah, like she's very like that kind of like secret and like privacy and you know it's like getting to do things like again with like the independence of these kid characters. I think that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, secret is a big theme here. And then like, when Colin is like, yeah, I'm not gonna tell my dad, I'm just gonna like run into his office. I was like, give him a heart attack. Which is almost like what happened. Like, but that last scene is really like beautifully done. And I love how like Ben Weatherstaff made the excuse to like go into the kitchen. He's like, I have to drop off some garden tools. And he's like, what's happening out the window? Like he knows what's coming and he wants to be there for the drama. Like I understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we wanna, I know that you said you didn't have really quotes and I only have
a few. Let's see. Yeah, I've just most of what I've got is like random moments and descriptions of nature. Okay. What else? Oh yeah, so this is the thing about the orange that I was talking about. When I was at school, my geography, I'm not going to say this in Yorkshire. When I was at school, my geography told us the world was shaped like an orange, and I found out before I was 10 that the whole orange doesn't belong to nobody. No one owns more than his bit of a quarter, and there's times it seems like there's not enough quarters to go round. But don't you think as you own the whole orange, or you'll find out where you're mistaken, and you won't find it out without hard knocks, which is like, yes, teach a child that, but also like the entire country of Britain could stand to learn.
Yeah. Yep. I think a lot of the ones that I saved were like, I don't know, like funny parts, like funny in the way that like just it's so dry and matter of fact, and I love it. At that moment, a very good thing was happening to her. 4 good things had happened to her, in fact, since she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She had felt as if she had understood a robin, and that he had understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life, and she had found out what it was to be sorry for someone. She was getting on. Like, I love like the way that the narrator like we'll just like progress update. Like Mary's a little bit less of a like monster now. Like it's just so funny.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about like the bit where they're like first they're eating so much and then they're not eating at all, and everyone, all the staff in the house are like, what is happening to these children?
Or the part where like Colin says like, yeah, I'm just not hungry, and like Mary makes that weird noise because she's thinking about like how much she was just eating, and the doctor is like, are you all right? And she's like, it was something between a sneeze and a cough, and it got into my throat. Like she's just so like or the part too where like I think it's one of their first conversations maybe, and they've been talking for like hours at this point, and then Colin goes like, do you know what we've never thought of? We're cousins. I love it. I have a couple apparently from like the tantrum scene, because I just obviously it's like not good what's happening, but like it's such a good Mary moment. So the nurse like is freaking out and comes to her room and says, no one can do anything with him. You come and try like a good child. He likes you. He turned me out of the room this morning, said Mary, stamping her foot in excitement. The stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was that she had been afraid she might find Mary crying and hiding her head under the bedclothes. That's right, she said. You're in the right humor. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as ever you can. It was not until afterward that Mary realized that the thing had been funny as well as dreadful, that it was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened that they came to a little girl just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin himself. Yeah. And then she like screams all those horrible things at him, and it's like, a nice sympathetic child could neither have thought nor said such things, but it just happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for this hysterical boy whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict.
Yeah. And like that's why I don't understand people who ship Mary and Colin, because they would spend their whole lives screaming at each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that should have been one of our discussion questions, is like why we are Team Dickon and you cannot change our mind. Yeah. I like, it's one of those things, I'm sure they would have been expected to get married, but I just can't see it. And also, I don't think Mary would marry anybody just because it was like, you know, I feel like she's pretty good at standing up for herself. Also, she's independently wealthy as far as I know, so I don't think she could even be like pressured into it, so I think she'd do all right. I assume she would want to marry Dickon. I mean, he's great.
Yeah, no, but like she and Dickon are actually good together. She and Colin would just like
yeah, no, it would not be good. It would not be good. I think you and I have talked about before, like the number of like fan fiction stories that have Dickon dying in World War I. I'm like, okay, yeah, probably, but I don't need like fan fiction is not the place for this. Like, let's see, do we have any? Oh, so this is one of the parts we were talking about. So Colin is asking Mrs. Sowerby if she believes in magic, and I'm also not going to read this in Yorkshire. I would be very bad at it. She says, that I do, lad. I never knowed it by that name, but what does the name matter? I warrant they call it a different name in France and a different one in Germany. The same thing is set the seed swelling and the sun shining made thee a well lad, and it's the good thing. It isn't like us poor fools as thinks it matters if it's called different names. The big good thing doesn't stop to worry, bless thee. It goes on making worlds by the million, worlds like us. Never thee stop believing in the big good thing and knowing the world's full of it, and call it what thou likes. They were singing to it when I come into the garden, and so that was the doxology part. And then she says, the magic listened when you sung the doxology. It would have listened to anything that sung. It was the joy that mattered. What's names to the joy maker? So just, it's interesting because it's like, I can see like some of it reads like, yeah, people like different paths, you know, and like people call it different things, and that's fine. But then it's also just like a really interesting portrayal of like the singing and the magic. I don't know. It's just like interesting.
Yeah. I had two like parenting ones, I guess. One was them as is not wanted, scarce ever thrives, which is succinct but true. And mother says that 2 worst things as can happen to a child is never to have his own way or always to have it. She doesn't know which is worse.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, and then the part we were talking about this one too is Colin says, "You were just what I wanted. I wished you were my mother, as well as Dickens." All at once, Susan Sowerby bent down and drew him with her warm arms close against the bosom under the blue cloak, as if he had been Dickens' brother. The quick mist swept over her eyes. "Dear lad," she said, "thy own mother's in this here very garden, I do believe. She could not keep out of it. Thy father must come back to thee. He must." Yeah, which I think that's really beautiful. There's that line about like, maybe it's when they're talking about her portrait, and they're like, any mother who has to leave her children early. It's like, yeah. So there's some really, really heartbreaking, but good moments.
The other thing we didn't talk about is that Mrs. Sowerby writes a letter to Mr. Craven, which is bold. Like,
right, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
She doesn't like tell Mrs. Medlock that she could write to me or anything.
She's like, "Hey, you should come back." Like, yeah, that's a good point. She's kind of like, maybe that's where Dickon gets it, is like everybody just kind of lets her get away with stuff because like she's just such a good person and she's so smart. Yeah. And she, in the letter, she's even like, "Yeah, remember that time I was, very bold and I spoke to you? So here I am writing you this letter telling you get home." I'm not telling you why, but you should. Yeah. Any other like quotes or scenes? I feel like I don't know why this part left such an impression on me, but like the part where it's raining and she goes and she explores all of the rooms. I love that. I don't know why. Maybe because again, it's got that like gothic, like huge house and it's raining and blah blah blah. But yeah, there's a lot of like that. Even if I don't remember specific lines, it's like there's certain scenes that really stick out to me. Like I love every time I read this book, I just love the description of her finding the key and finding the door and how it like, because the robin lands on like the earth that was turned up. Like I love it.
Yeah, like she's just so clever. Like the key's here and then there's ivy here. There's nothing behind it. There must be a door. Like she's so logical about finding it.
Yeah, Mary is so smart. I love that. And when she's like, which I think makes sense, she's like, "Well, I think I can trust Colin, but I'm not quite sure." So she's like, "What if hypothetically there's this garden?" And it's like, and she does like describe it very specifically, but like the overall way she talks about it is like, it's like with her uncle, where she's like, "Could I have a bit of earth if it's like nobody wants it and it's out of the way? No one's using it." And he's like, "From where?" And she's like, "Wherever. I don't know." Like, she's just so smart.
Yeah, I love the bit later on where she tells Colin they found the garden, and he's like, "When you described it before, it was as if you'd seen it." And she's like, "So, funny story." Like,
yeah. And I like that we don't like, I think it just cuts to the next chapter, so we don't know if he had a reaction, but I like that they didn't have a big fight because he was like, "How come you didn't tell me immediately?" Like, and even when she's like, when she tells Dickon, because he's the first person who finds out besides her, and she's like, "I don't know anything about boys. Can you keep a secret?" Like, and he's like, "Well, animals show me where their babies are, so I'm pretty good at secrets." And she's like, "Okay." But, yeah. I think that's all the things I had. Hana, would you like to introduce our next book? Because it is related.
Yeah. So the August book will be A Bit of Earth by Kurunoriyazi, which is a retelling of this book, a modern retelling with a Pakistani main character, which, as we've discussed, the representation of India is interesting in this one. So I'm looking forward to seeing like how that's all reimagined. And the live show for that one, I will be hosting it, but it will still be on Kara's channel, and it will be the first weekend of August. I think that's the 4th and 5th. Exact time to be confirmed, but it'll be roughly around then. So if you are planning to read along with us, then that's when it will be.
Yes. Yes, and we will, update and like confirm the time like on our social media like we usually do. But I don't think this one is especially long, so we should
It is 355 pages.
Okay.
Which isn't so bad.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Like, I know that we've been talking about this book coming out since it was announced, because like we both obviously have read The Secret Garden many times, so I can't wait for Hana to lead us in discussion for this book. I think it's going to be great. Other than that, I think that is everything. Thank you for being here, and thank you for watching this back later. I know people do that as well. Just really looking forward to continuing to read and discuss things with Hana. And as I said at the very beginning, we're going to be throwing in another Frances Harding book. Exact time to be confirmed, but we're thinking it's going to be January, because like I think her novella is coming out within the next few months. So hopefully that'll give everyone enough time to acquire it if they would like. But yes, we will find ways to put Frances Harding in any project.
Yes, and to just create projects at every possible opportunity.
That's really what we're doing. Okay, so thank you guys, and Hana, thank you so much for co-hosting this with me. Very excited to continue, and we will see all of you guys then. Bye.